If you've paid attention to the news, you know that the Trump impeachment hearings are in full swing. But what is impeachment? What exactly is the House of Representatives looking for? And what happens if the president gets impeached? Dr. Adam Carrington of Hillsdale College joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm your host, Sam Chen. If you've paid any attention to the news as of late, you know full well that the Trump impeachment hearings are in full swing. After months, weeks of talk, the House of Representatives has formally opened an impeachment inquiry into the president's actions. But what is impeachment? On what grounds can the president be impeached? Where do we go from here? What exactly are the House and Senate looking for? And is there a precedent for what's going on? What's happened in past impeachments with past presidents? Dr. Adam Carrington, assistant professor of politics at Hillsdale College, joins us as we break down those questions. Dr. Carrington, welcome back to the program. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you back. And so we appreciate your insight and clarity into these questions. In a time like this, I think we need that insight and clarity now more than ever. There's a lot of conversation around the impeachment topic. We were talking before the show. We just had this conversation a few months ago about the potential of an impeachment inquiry and what that would entail. As you know, things in politics move quickly. Can we start by going through a quick run through of the events that's transpired since and where we are now? Why this conversation today?
Right. There was before, I think, more anticipation of what the Mueller report was going to reveal, which in the end, I think, didn't reveal much of that was worthy of impeachment, even though I think there were certainly some things that were worth noting. What's happened since is that it was revealed that there was a congressionally approved support, money support for Ukraine. And that the president was supposed to dispense this before the end of the fiscal year, and that it seems that there was at least an accusation that the president pressured Ukraine to conduct investigations into the 2016 elections and into possible wrongdoing by the son of Joe Biden, who happens to be his primary potential rival in the Democratic National Convention, what they're trying to figure out. And that the question is, was this an attempt by the president to basically use his stature and power as chief executive for personal political gain in the foreign policy realm? And I think that's the main question, is why he wanted these investigations, why he held up the funding. And I think a lot of it is not so much did he have some discretion to withhold it, but was withholding it an abuse of power? And then is that abuse of power impeachable?
Let's go to that question that you just asked of, is that abuse of power impeachable? I mean, obviously the first question is this within his rights? Is this an abuse of power? But you framed it in a different question when you said, is that abuse of power impeachable? I know we touched on it last time. Let's revisit that briefly here. What is an impeachable offense? I think there's a lot of conversation around impeachment, and certainly we've heard, I think ever since the Clinton impeachment, we have heard that term thrown out with every president who's taken office. But what actually is an impeachable offense?
The Constitution says an impeachable offense involves either treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. And treason is defined in the Constitution. That's not on the table here in any legitimate sense. There is some talk about whether this is bribery. I think that's fairly weak as well. Normally it's that you're being bribed, which we have no evidence the president has been. So it really comes down to high crimes and misdemeanors. And we now have sort of two camps on this. And this happened in the Clinton impeachment too. One camp says high crimes and misdemeanors need to be actual criminal conduct, something that could be convicted in court. Mm-hmm. The other side tends to say that it's that plus the political abuses of power that may not be provable in court, but seem to be something that makes one unfit for office. What Hamilton, I think, called in Federalist 65 political crimes, even if they're not actual legal crimes. And so you saw this in the Clinton impeachment, where Republicans were pushing the legal argument. The Democrats were pushing more, this isn't really a full abuse of power. And in some ways, we're seeing the same here. A lot of Republicans are saying you can't prove any illegal activity in a court of law here. And I think so far that's true. Versus the Democrats saying this is an abuse of his power and therefore falls within the realm of impeachment. I think that's where it breaks down.
Along those lines, where are we right now in the current process? I mean, it's in the House of Representatives. If you go on Twitter, you see clearly a lot of people tweeting to their congressmen, their senators about how they should vote. There seems to be a bit of a confusion about who does what in an impeachment process. At what point does the president get removed? If the president gets removed, where do we stand right now in that inquiry? What's the process from here on out?
Where we stand now is the House is continuing a process of discerning whether they should in fact impeach the president. And what an impeachment is a formal accusation of wrongdoing. And really, all the Constitution says is the House has to, if they're going to impeach, they have to take a vote on it. It needs to be a majority vote. It needs to be on specific articles. But where we are now is it seems like the House is close to finishing up an investigation into these matters. And what we'll probably see next is likely a formal drawing up of impeachment articles. In other words, a formal drawing up of actual charges, and then probably a debate and vote on the House of Representatives itself. Any of those articles that get a majority support will then go to the Senate, where an actual formal-like trial will be conducted with the Senate as jurors, prosecuting and defending attorneys, and then if 2/3 of the senators believe it's removable, then you'd actually have the president taken out of office. So part of the confusion is impeachment is nothing more than formal accusation, not removal. That's what the Senate decides if it comes to them from the House.
Right, and this obviously rooted in the Federalist concept of separation of powers, that the legislative branch is divided and each side has a piece of the responsibility here to prevent any one body from having too much power. To your point, formal articles of impeachment have not even been filed yet. So this is just an inquiry to see if there are potential constitutional issues that they can file formal impeachment charges on.
That's correct. And I think a way to think about this, there's a little bit of confusion about this, I think partly because the only other impeachment we've had in our lifetimes is the Clinton impeachment. And there, most of the formal inquiry was conducted not by the House, but by independent counsel Kenneth Starr, if people remember that inquiry. And then basically the research, the conclusions of it were given to the House, and then the House had to decide what to do with it. Here, there's been no process like that, which means the House itself has to conduct its own inquiry, its own investigation, call its own witnesses, subpoena its own documents. And so we're seeing the House do both steps of that process. And I think we're close to the end of the investigation side. And then what we'll see is something looking a little bit more like what we saw in the Clinton impeachment going forward.
Can you address briefly, there's been in the news, we had Congressman Schiff, who's leading the inquiry portion of this, had an informal inquiry, which has now become a formal inquiry. What's the difference?
The difference constitutionally is nothing, to be honest. All the House really says, all the Constitution really says is the House has to determine whether it wants to impeach, full stop. And everything else is left to them. Now, what people are talking about is in the past, there have been formal launches of the impeachment power, formal votes by the House to state we are officially stating we are in impeachment mode. And even though the Constitution doesn't say one way or another on that, There are some questions about whether that is a process that's necessary for the House committees to have their appropriate powers. There is some questions about whether that's helpful as far as the fairness of the proceedings, but those are all questions that the House has to decide based on what they think is fair and the proper the most effective mode of proceeding, not based on anything that the Constitution demands.
Okay. And with this particular inquiry, when we talked a few months ago, to your point, really the precipitating event for that was the Mueller report coming out and whether there was something impeachable in that Mueller report. This is a different situation. I mean, there's a lot of politicos, especially the Republican Party, that would like to say that this is just Mueller 2.0. This is just their attempt to get rid of the president. But this is an inquiry on a different matter. What is the scope of the inquiry for the House? What should Congressman Schiff and congressional Democrats and congressional Republicans be looking for as they conduct this inquiry?
I think the main thing they need to stick to, and I think that that's an important point, is they need to stick to real questions and important questions to try to at least minimize the partisanship. I think the ship has sailed on whether there's going to be partisanship on this both ways.
That's fair.
But I think that what the focus really needs to be is sort of twofold, related back to something I said earlier. One, why did the president withhold this aid to Ukraine? Because I don't think there's any question he had a right to do so within his powers, at least till the end of the fiscal year. Did he do it because it was in the national interests of the United States, or did he do it to use the power of the presidency for his own personal gain? I think that's a fundamental question. And then the second is that if you think he did, which I think would be an abuse of power, do you think it's worthy of rising to the level of trying to remove him from office? And it's interesting, his Republican defenders of him are kind of split on this. You have the camp that says this was in the national interests and there's no wrongdoing, hence no impeachment. You have a number of his defenders that say, yeah, this was improper, this was maybe even wrong, but it doesn't rise to the level of impeachment.
Interesting. Adam, hold that thought. Don't go away. I want to come back to this riveting conversation right after these messages. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, thanks again for being here. Let's pick up right where we left off. We were talking about the scope of the current inquiry and what the House, and when we say that, we mean House Democrats as well as House Republicans, that something of this gravity should be taken seriously by both parties and by all the members, and it's really their responsibility here. I want to ask you about that particular inquiry and this impeachment process and some of the constitutional questions that arise from it, since this ultimately comes down to a constitutional question. One of them is, I mean, probably key among a lot of these is the question of the whistleblower. And obviously there are provisions in their national security protocol to allow for anonymous whistleblowers. The idea that with the amount of classifications and security clearances needed and specific potential implications of having someone outed, there is a whistleblower protection. And you see on the one hand, Chairman Schiff is very adamant about protecting the identity of the whistleblower. On the other side, a number of Republicans are trying to get at that identity. This brings, at least to me, this brings to light a constitutional question of protecting the identity of a whistleblower, the principle of the anonymous whistleblower, and all the security ramifications that come with it, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the president having a right to face his accuser, which is also part of due process. How does that break down for you when you look at that with regards to the constitutional right of each?
Right. That is a good way to put it. And you're right, there's been a lot of controversy on it. I think that really the question is one of due process. There's no constitutional right to be a whistleblower. That is meant as a protection that is put in place merely by law to try to, as you said, protect outing possible corruption or illegality in the government. I think what really you have to ask on here is twofold on the president's part. Who is formally his accuser and when can he confront that accuser? And Right now, the whistleblower is probably legally equivalent to an anonymous informant. If you call the police and say, I saw someone that looks suspicious, you might want to check it out in our neighborhood. There's right now no legal precedent to force that person to testify unless that what you said becomes formal testimony before a court of law or formal testimony before a grand jury or some other legal proceeding. And so far what's happened is Chairman Schiff has avoided bringing the whistleblower complaint into the record because I think he knows that if that happens, there would be some very legitimate claims that he needs to be, that whistleblower needs to be brought in. Instead, he's tried to build the case off of other aspects, other witnesses, other information. That said, I think the other question is, when do you get to face your accuser? And where that comes from is the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to face your accuser in a criminal proceeding, basically at a trial. And in this instance, one, an impeachment inquiry is not a criminal proceeding. The president doesn't stand to go to jail for it. That's what a criminal proceeding is. But second, it's not a trial yet. So I think it would be a clear violation of due process if something in the official record, someone testifying in the official record, could not be confronted at the Senate trial. Okay. I think here it's just a question of what's fair, not what's required by due process.
That's a good and coherent breakdown. I appreciate that. Let me also then ask you about the with testimonies, the idea of the subpoena. How much legal authority does the House have to subpoena in this situation, or the Senate during the trial? And how far does executive privilege extend? And so the constitutional struggle I see here is between the rights of one body to subpoena witnesses, and they could be held in contempt of Congress, I believe, if they don't come. On the other hand, there is executive privilege to protect potentially national security interests. And how far does that extend? Former Ambassador John Bolton, no longer a member of the executive. Does he fall under that executive privilege? What about former Mayor Giuliani, who has never been a part of the current administration's executive? Where does that tension lie?
Right. The tension is that the president has certain powers as the chief executive. He can't execute them on his own. Mm-hmm. So what he needs are subordinates that he can get counsel from, that he can order, and there needs to be some secrecy to that for national security reasons, but also for the quality of the information and advice he gets. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you're right. The impeachment is a power given by the Constitution to the House, and they should therefore have the means to carry that out in a effective manner. And before, the idea has been that subpoenas, calling witnesses are all modes and helpful ways of doing that. And so really the answer is both are legitimate in and of themselves. What we have to actually decide is in each case, how do we balance them? And that's really going to painfully be witness to witness, even question to question. What does the House have to have in order to make known the legitimacy of this inquiry or its illegitimacy? What national security issues are, one, too sensitive that they shouldn't get out in the open, and two, not pertinent to this? So even with Giuliani, even with Ambassador Bolton, those are all questions that we're going to have to answer in particular. And part of the debate's going to be, how do we decide?
Sure.
Is a court going to have to look at these privately and make that determination? We had a little bit of that in the Nixon impeachment. Mm-hmm. Should the House conduct its sessions in executive session so that it's not to the public till down the road? Those are the kind of questions we're going to have to ask to balance it. And the real answer is, depending upon the witness and depending upon the question, we have to protect executive privilege and we have to protect the legitimacy and the power of the House to conduct impeachment.
So we have to protect both sides of the tension.
Exactly, because both are legitimate, but this is where separation of powers at times has to get worked out in the thorny applications of it in a way that respects both.
Sure, and the balance is what our democracy is built on.
Exactly, and we've been told that if one overwhelms the other, if one branch overwhelms the other, you've got tyranny. But at the same time, we have to make sure that that balance is real, legitimate, and respects the powers of both sides.
Sure. Piggybacking off of that, you mentioned the Nixon impeachment. I've read a few other scholars, constitutional law scholars like yourself, who believe that looking back at past potential impeachments and incidents, what's happening here may be closer to something with the Reagan administration, Iran-Contra perhaps, more so than something with Nixon or even something with President Clinton, though Clinton was the last president we had impeached. Along with that, also, and the national security, foreign relations implications, we also had this situation where you had the Republican members of Congress who broke into SCIF, which is the sensitive compartmented information facility, a place that is on lockdown, is top secret. You're not allowed to have phones there. And we had about a dozen Republican members of Congress who broke in, were filming. There's been a lot of almost just blatant disregard for the sensitivity of this. Looking back at the Clinton impeachment, the Iran-Contra affair with Nixon, or with President Reagan, Oliver North, the Nixon impeachment that led to resignation, is this the way that our members of Congress are dealing with this? Is this common throughout the history of situations like this, or is this something that is this a different? Is something stand out about the way it's being done today that you haven't seen before?
I think that obviously, and the Federalist Papers and the founders knew this would be a partisan process,
Sure.
admitted it would be, and that means things are going to get ugly at times. Mm-hmm. But I think that that there's a special rancor to this, but I don't think it has so much to do with the impeachment inquiry itself as two factors that distinguish us from the time of Nixon and the time of Reagan in the 80s, and actually in some ways makes us a little bit more like the Andrew Johnson impeachment, where you're just coming out of a civil war, you're coming out of massive divides that are much more fundamental than we've seen that we saw, in future impeachment debates. And we talk today that we're in a kind of some people like to call it a cold civil war. So I think the fundamental nature of our divides makes this more rancorous than not seeing the other side as legitimate. But I also think media, the congressmen play to their constituents and to media sound bites a lot more because of the way media operates now, because it's so much more pervasive than they did in the past, which means they're still partisan. They always were, but the way they manifest it, I think, is much more public, much more grandstanding, much more, and this goes both ways, much more in the sense of trying to create a show. And I think that that's related to our deep divides and to the media environment.
I couldn't agree more. Adam, thank you again for that. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, this has been an insightful and imperative conversation. I hope our viewers understand the gravity of what's happening. I think you and I share that concern. I want to close by asking you two quick questions. The first being, where do you think this goes ultimately with the House and the Senate? What happens to President Trump? And then secondly, as a professor of politics, as someone who teaches government, what advice would you give the public as they watch the impeachment hearings? What do you hope they take away from it?
Right. Two great questions. I think that first, what I think is probably going to happen is that the president will be impeached. As far as how many different articles there'll be and how many will get to the Senate, I'm not sure. I think that the Senate trial will probably be pretty short and that the president will be acquitted. And I think that there just won't be enough votes to say that this rose to the level of removal. And I think that that will then set up the 2020 election as in part a referendum on whether the House and the Senate conducted themselves properly. And as far as the American people, what I'd encourage them to do is to not get entirely discouraged. I think there's some discouraging things about this process. There's the fact that we are doing this is showing a lack of health in parts of our republic. At the same time, to recognize that we are still a government whose constitution begins "we the people," and that ultimately the people will decide on whether this was a legitimate process. They'll decide on to the degree of what corruption is and what they believe needs done. And that I would say it just reinforces to keep yourselves informed. Ultimately, our government is not run by people in Washington. It's run by you and me, and the founders, I think, designed that rightly, and that we need to use this process as a way to encourage better use of that rule that we have, not become too discouraged if the process doesn't always go perfectly, because let's be frank, it's involves human beings, and none of us are perfect.
Right. What is it that Madison says in Federalist 39, that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, and yet he sets up a government where the people retain the power?
Exactly, and he says in Federalist, I believe it's 51, that you also need limits on government, because government's not run by angels.
Right.
And so what we have here is the process of impeachment, but the process of elections for the people that do impeach, all are set up to try to maximize the best of humanity and minimize the worst of humanity. And I think the founders' system, despite the extreme tension and problems we sometimes run into, has shown itself to last through a lot worse than even what we're dealing with right now.
All right, great. Adam, thank you again for joining us. I appreciate the conversation. That is all the time we have tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Join us again next week as we address and unpack another issue. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.